The evening air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked stone, a mist curling around the lampposts of the narrow Parisian street. Inside the opulent yet suffocatingly silent study of Chateau Duroc, the body lay slumped across an antique leather chair, the once vibrant tapestry of his life reduced to a tableau of stillness. Henri Duroc, a man whose wealth and reputation had been matched only by his meticulous taste, had met an end so sudden and inexplicable that the servants dared not speak of it above a whisper. The doors of the study had been locked from the inside, windows latched and unbroken, and yet there was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no faint trace of anyone having entered or exited the room. What drew the eyes of those first on the scene was not the body itself, but the peculiar note lying upon the polished mahogany desk. It was a slip of paper, torn roughly from a notebook, inscribed with a single, almost mocking line, "Time reveals all, yet none can grasp it." The ink appeared fresh, its elegant cursive belying the urgency of its content. It seemed at once profound and meaningless, a cryptic riddle that promised nothing and yet demanded attention. Those who found it could not decide if it was a taunt from the killer or the final thoughts of a man who had understood too much. The chateau had been empty for hours before the body was discovered. Duroc's staff claimed to have retired early, save for the night butler, whose testimony was hesitant and faltering. He swore he had left the master of the house reading by the fire at precisely 10 o'clock, only to return hours later and find the impossible. There were no sounds of doors being opened or closed, no echo of footsteps across the marble floors. The servants' statements, while sincere, wove a tapestry of uncertainty that only deepened the enigma. Detective Hercule Poirot arrived under the cloak of darkness, his small figure imposing in its quiet precision. He moved with a deliberate grace, inspecting the room as though it were a living being, its walls breathing secrets that refused to be spoken aloud. The study was a room of contradictions, lavish yet orderly, inviting yet cold. Books lined the shelves with exacting regularity. A fine crystal decanter sat half-filled on a side table, untouched, while the fire burned low, casting shadows that danced along the ornate wallpaper. It was a setting perfectly curated, yet it harbored a depth too abrupt to belong naturally to such an environment. Poirot's eyes settled on the body, noting the subtle tension in the limbs, the slight curl of the fingers as though they had been holding something, a gesture frozen in time. He examined the note, turning it over delicately, observing the pressure of the pen, the unique flow of each letter. There was something calculated about it, as if the writer had paused mid-thought, perhaps even delighted in leaving a puzzle for those who would follow. It was not simply a note, it was a message, a fragment of a larger design, demanding scrutiny. He scrutinized the locks, inspecting the delicate mechanisms as only Poirot could. Each bolt, each catch, bore no sign of tampering. The windows, too, remained unyielding in their confinement. Yet there was a subtle hint in the arrangement of objects, a chair slightly askew, a book lying open on a page of astronomy, the faint trace of a smudge on the otherwise pristine desk, that suggested the room, in its stillness, had whispered a story. It was a story that did not reveal itself in the obvious ways, but rather in the invisible choreography of a moment stretched to the edge of comprehension. Poirot's mind, ever restless and probing, began to reconstruct the timeline. The butler's testimony, though flawed, provided an anchor. From there, he considered every entrance and exit, every object, every nuance of lighting and shadow. And then, like a single drop of ink falling into water, a realization began to form: the crime was not what it seemed. It was neither a hasty act of violence nor a random misfortune. It was, in its essence, a demonstration. A deliberate orchestration intended to baffle, to confound, and to challenge the intellect of anyone who dared attempt to untangle it. As the night deepened, the chateau seemed to hold its breath, the mist pressing against the windows, the old walls humming with secrets. Poirot, with his keen eyes and methodical reasoning, began to unravel the subtle threads that connected the man, the note, the room, and the mysterious circumstances of the death. Every detail mattered, from the faintest scuff on the floor to the pattern of the ink strokes, for in this locked room, in this final hour, the answer lay hidden in the deliberate precision of the crime. And Poirot, as always, was prepared to see what others could not, to perceive the invisible patterns woven by a hand both cunning and meticulous. The case, he realized, would not yield its secrets easily. It was a puzzle built not just on motive, but on the careful choreography of space and time, a riddle that mocked the ordinary observer and rewarded only the keenest mind. And Hercule Poirot, with his unmatched acuity and his obsession with the order of the universe, would be that mind? Poirot spent the early hours of the morning meticulously examining every detail of the study, his movements deliberate and measured, each gesture revealing his methodical thought process. He returned repeatedly to the note, scrutinizing the formation of letters, the spacing between words, the subtle tilts that might betray the hand behind it. Something, he sensed, was being concealed, not through force but through finesse, a deliberate choice to mislead. The room itself seemed complicit, the arrangement of objects whispering hints in a language only a trained eye could decipher. He inspected the bookshelves more closely, noting the open volume on astronomy. Its placement was unusual, not at eye level but rather on a lower shelf, as though meant to be seen from a seated position. The page it lay open to detail the phases of the moon and the precise moments of lunar eclipses. Poirot's mind raced, connecting this seemingly mundane detail to the timing of the crime. Could the killer have used this as a reference, a marker to indicate the moment when action was to be taken? The thought seemed improbable, yet in a crime so carefully orchestrated, nothing was impossible. Poirot then turned his attention to the faint smudge on the desk, a nearly imperceptible streak that led from the note to the edge of the table. He crouched to examine it closely, his small, sharp eyes missing nothing. It was not a fingerprint nor any residue left by common handling. It seemed more like the trace of something fleeting, something that had left a mark only in passing. He felt the familiar thrill of a mystery deepening, the sensation that the answer was close, yet teasingly out of reach. He called the night butler again, gently questioning him about the evening in detail. The man's nervousness was palpable, but Poirot's calm and measured presence coaxed more information than the frantic servant's testimonies had offered. The butler admitted that the master had been unusually contemplative that evening, spending long minutes staring at the open window, as if expecting someone or something. He also mentioned that a small mechanical device, a pocket chronometer of some sort, had been placed near the fireplace, ticking quietly through the night. The implication struck Poirot immediate. Time had played a deliberate role in this murder. The note, the careful timing, even the precise positioning of objects, it all hinted at a choreography that required perfect temporal execution. Poirot's gaze fell on the fireplace itself. The device, a small, intricate instrument, was exactly where the butler had said. Its ticking was regular, yet there was a subtle irregularity, a pause, almost imperceptible, that suggested intentional calibration. Poirot examined the mechanism and realized it was more than a simple timepiece. It was a device that could trigger an action at a precise moment. His heart quickened with the realization that the murder had been executed with mechanical precision, eliminating the need for a visible assailant. The locked room, the absence of entry, and the eerie calm of the scene were no accidents. They were the result of meticulous planning. As dawn approached, casting a pale light across the study, Poirot began to map out the sequence of events. Every movement of the victim, every glance at the clock, every tick of the device had been accounted for by someone who knew the habits of Henri Duroc intimately. Poirot's mind, a web of logic and deduction, began to visualize the crime in 3 dimensions, reconstructing the moments before death with an almost cinematic clarity. The room's seeming impossibility was beginning to unravel, revealing a pattern both elegant and sinister. Yet even as he traced the invisible threads, Poirot knew that the surface had only been scratched. The note, the smudge, the mechanical device, all were pieces of a puzzle that extended beyond the study, beyond the chateau, and perhaps even beyond what anyone had yet imagined. He understood that to solve this crime fully, he would have to probe the private life of Henri Duroc, uncovering motives that were hidden beneath layers of wealth, influence, and secrecy. The challenge exhilarated him. A crime so perfect in its execution demanded a mind equally precise in its reasoning. Poirot moved to the window, looking out at the mist-shrouded grounds of the chateau. The world outside was waking slowly, oblivious to the death that had occurred within these walls. And yet, within the study, every object, every shadow, every tick of the hidden mechanism spoke volumes to the detective who could listen. He knew that the next steps would be crucial, that following the faintest trail of evidence could illuminate the mind of a killer capable of orchestrating such a flawless, yet ultimately revealing, act. The final hour before death had left clues as delicate as a whisper, and Poirot was prepared to catch them all. Poirot began his questioning in the drawing-room, where the early morning light filtered through heavy curtains, casting long, muted shadows that seemed to echo the secrets of the chateau. The first to be interviewed was Madame Duroc, Henri's widow, whose composure was impeccable, though her hands trembled ever so slightly as she clasped a delicate handkerchief. Her voice was calm, measured, each word carefully chosen. Yet Poirot detected a subtle hesitation, a pause that suggested she was not revealing the full truth. She claimed to have been asleep in her chambers by 10, hearing nothing of the events until the butler's alarmed call roused her hours later. Her testimony, while consistent, was too neatly framed, lacking the small irregularities that genuine memory often carried. Poirot filed the observation away, noting that Polish sometimes masks concealment. Next came the butler, whose account Poirot had begun to shape in his mind, yet further questioning revealed inconsistencies too delicate to overlook. The man insisted he had only checked on the master once, yet there was a lingering uncertainty in his timeline. He mentioned seeing the chronometer placed near the fireplace, yet when pressed about its exact location, he wavered between two positions, a detail that seemed insignificant, but in Poirot's careful analysis, such minutiae often proved crucial. The detective's sharp eyes lingered on the man's posture, the tiny hesitation before answering each question. A man tells the truth in what he forgets, not always in what he remembers, Poirot murmured to himself, the principle guiding him like a lantern through the fog of conflicting statements. The gardener, summoned next, presented an even more puzzling perspective. He spoke of seeing a shadow moving past a window late in the evening, though he could not be certain of its direction or identity. His account, full of conjecture and fragments, offered little clarity, yet his insistence on recalling the details seemed almost performative, as though he were eager to be part of the investigation, to be noticed. Poirot considered this carefully. Those who wish to be noticed often leave traces of their own making, a false breadcrumb trail intended to mislead. The detective's mind quietly catalogued every word, every emphasis, weighing credibility against motive with his usual meticulous care. A young maid, timid and reluctant, was called forward. Her story contrasted sharply with the others. She admitted she had lingered near the study's hallway earlier in the evening, tasked with bringing a tray of refreshments, but claimed she had heard nothing unusual. Her tone was soft, almost apologetic, yet her eyes darted to the corners of the room, as if fearing judgment for what she might have seen but had not. Poirot noted the difference between omission and concealment, understanding that silence could be as revealing as speech. Something about the girl's demeanor suggested she had glimpsed a fragment of truth, something not yet articulated, and he made a mental note to return to her later. The family lawyer, a precise and imposing man, provided a different kind of obstruction. His account focused almost entirely on the legal implications of Henri Duroc's affairs, weaving a narrative of potential beneficiaries and minor disputes. Yet within his words, subtle contradictions appeared. He referenced documents that the detective knew did not yet exist, and suggested timings for visits that conflicted with other testimonies. Poirot detected a deliberate strategy, a layering of half-truths designed to divert attention. Every answer was weighted, measured to steer the investigation subtly, perhaps to protect a client or a secret. As the questioning proceeded, Poirot began to perceive patterns in the dissonance, the gaps between statements, and the moments of over-clarity. Some witnesses were too eager, some too careful, each shaping their narrative to conceal or reveal, sometimes simultaneously. There were contradictions, small and deliberate, like a chess player sacrificing pawns to protect a queen. Poirot, always attuned to the psychology of deception, recognized that the killer might be speaking in riddles even while hiding behind others. By mid-morning, the drawing-room had transformed into a quiet theater of suspicion, each participant a performer on a stage, each statement a carefully constructed line in a drama with high stakes. Poirot, seated in a low chair, his hands steepled, allowed the conversations to settle in his mind like sediment in a jar. Each witness, each statement, and each small contradiction was a grain, and with the patient sorting of his intellect, the pattern of the deception began to emerge. He sensed that behind the surface of the chateau's polished routines and orderly halls lay motives layered deep, hidden behind loyalty, fear, greed, and perhaps the thrill of a perfect crime. And it was within the subtle fractures of truth and falsehood that Poirot knew he would find the key. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet slips of language, the imperceptible hesitation in a glance, the tiny incongruities that betray intention. The voices of deception had begun to sing their song, and Poirot, with the precision of a master conductor, was listening intently, ready to discern the melody that would lead to the unraveling of this locked-room mystery. Poirot retreated to the quiet of the library, a room thick with the scent of old leather and polished wood, where he could lay out the threads of the investigation without the interruptions of anxious witnesses. He spread before him a series of notes, statements, observations, the subtle discrepancies he had observed in each account. Each suspect, he realized, carried a plausible motive, yet none alone could account for the meticulous orchestration of the crime. The situation was a labyrinth of human desire, each passage winding and treacherous, where the walls were built of greed, jealousy, fear, and hidden resentments. Madame Duroc, outwardly composed, revealed the first layer. Poirot considered the social and financial pressures she faced. Her husband's estate was vast, and his passing would significantly alter her standing and autonomy. Yet the widow's careful demeanor, the slight tremor in her hands, and her subtle omissions suggested more than mere self-interest. Could there have been a fear of exposure, a secret she needed to protect? Poirot catalogued her mannerisms with precision, noting that the absence of obvious alarm could mask something deeper, a suppressed tension that could explain participation in an intricate plan. The butler's motives were less apparent on the surface, yet his proximity to every movement in the chateau made him a key observer, perhaps a silent participant. He was not merely a servant followee. Orders, he had access, knowledge, and the capacity to manipulate small details unnoticed. Poirot reviewed the subtle contradictions in his testimony, and a pattern began to emerge, minor inconsistencies that suggested selective memory, perhaps intended to hide either complicity or knowledge of the true sequence of events. The butler's loyalty, often assumed absolute, might be conditional, shaped by fear of losing position or facing reprisal. Then there were the peripheral characters, the gardener, the young maid, the lawyer. Each presented a tangle of motives, each a thread in the larger web. The gardener's need to assert his vigilance and importance hinted at envy or ambition, while the maid's timid demeanor concealed a perceptiveness that could have given her access to secret moments or whispered conversations. The lawyer's careful shaping of legal timelines and documents pointed to a calculated preservation of advantage, whether for the estate or for personal gain. Poirot recognized that the motives were not isolated. They overlapped, intersected, and at times contradicted, creating a complexity that could obscure a single truth while revealing a network of potential culpability. As he examined the chronometer again, the detective's mind traced the connections between action and opportunity. Timing had been the essential element, and understanding who could manipulate it required more than the observation of mere presence. It demanded an insight into knowledge of Henri Duroc's habits, trust within the household, and the ability to anticipate the movements of others. Poirot began to align alibis with these practical necessities, marking where gaps and vulnerabilities existed, who had access at key moments, who understood the mechanical precision required, and who, above all, had the motive strong enough to risk exposure in pursuit of that end. Poirot drew lines between names, incidents, and motives, visualizing a network of human desire overlaid upon the physical space of the chateau. Jealousy whispered in the corners where relationships had frayed, greed simmered in the eyes of those poised to inherit or gain, and fear, an often silent but insidious force, loomed behind statements crafted with caution. The detective understood that the murder was less a random act than the inevitable outcome of tensions long simmering beneath the polished surface of wealth and propriety. He paused to reflect on the note. Time reveals all, yet none can grasp it. Now its meaning crystallized partially. The killer had exploited not only the mechanics of the room and the chronometer, but also the subtle psychological currents flowing through the household. Opportunity and motive were inseparable here. They intersected like the hands of a clock, each tick a potential move in a deliberate design. Poirot felt the threads of human emotion tighten into a coherent pattern, yet one crucial piece still eluded him. A connecting act, a decision, a spark that had set this careful sequence into motion. By the time the early afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the library floor, Poirot had constructed a provisional map of the tangled motives. No single explanation sufficed, yet each added clarity to the overall picture. The labyrinth of human desire was intricate and deceptive, yet within it lay the path to revelation. Poirot, with his unerring logic and his insistence on precision, was ready to trace that path fully, following the interplay of motive, opportunity, and timing to the point where the hidden hand of the killer would finally be revealed. The morning had deepened into a grey, overcast afternoon, when a commotion in the courtyard drew Poirot's attention. The local authorities had discovered a small, folded envelope tucked behind a loose brick in the chateau's garden wall. Inside, they claimed, was a partial confession. The handwriting matched that on the cryptic note found beside Henri Duroc's body. Immediately, the investigators hailed it as a breakthrough, a tangible piece of evidence that promised to close the case with satisfying finality. Reporters were whispered of, and the household buzzed with a tentative sense of relief. But Poirot remained outwardly calm, his small dark eyes narrowing ever so slightly. He examined the envelope, noting the neatness of its folding and the careful choice of paper. The writing within was indeed similar to the note in the study, yet something about the strokes seemed rehearsed, almost deliberate in its attempt to mimic urgency. Poirot's instinct, honed through decades of observing the human mind in extremes, stirred uneasily. This was too convenient, too neat. The discovery was treated as a solution by those who wished for closure, yet the detective perceived a subtle misalignment between what appeared obvious and what was real. Authorities declared the case closed. They approached suspects with the triumphal air of those who believed the puzzle solved, congratulating themselves for interpreting the evidence correctly. Madame Duroc maintained her composed exterior, though her eyes betrayed a fleeting relief, quickly masked. The butler, ever cautious, nodded with polite deference, as if acknowledging that the detective had confirmed what everyone already assumed. The gardener and the maid were gently eased from suspicion, their testimonies treated as peripheral background rather than pivotal insight. Poirot observed all of it, his mind a quiet storm, cataloguing what was said, what was left unsaid, and the faintest tremor of overpleasure in those eager to claim victory. Returning to the study, Poirot retraced the crime scene in detail. Every object, every shadow, every trace left in the room was reconsidered in the context of this newly solved case. He moved with deliberate care, touching neither surface unnecessarily, but observing the interplay of items with the precision of a watchmaker examining a delicate mechanism. The chronometer remained in place, its ticks steady, yet he could not ignore that the envelope had appeared far too easily, almost theatrically. How had the supposedly guilty party known exactly where and when to leave it for the authorities to find? Something about the timing, the positioning, the simplicity of the solution did not align with the complexity of the murder itself. Poirot's intuition, finely tuned to human psychology, suggested a layer of deception beyond the apparent. A clever criminal could manipulate the desires of others, planting false evidence to mislead both the investigators and the household. Here, Poirot mused, was a mind at work that anticipated not only opportunity, but also the reactions of those observing the stage. The envelope, while superficially decisive, might be nothing more than a misdirection, a calculated lure to draw attention away from the true perpetrator, who remained patient, hidden, and poised. He returned to the witnesses and suspects in subtle ways, watching their behavior as though the room itself were a mirror. Madame Duroc's polished demeanor seemed rehearsed under scrutiny. The butler's measured compliance held a faint tension. The young maid's timid glances lingered longer than casual observation could justify. Poirot sensed the pulse of hidden fear, ambition, or knowledge under the surface, and he understood that the real culprit was observing, waiting for the slightest shift in attention to act again or to continue the masquerade. The detective reconstructed the timeline in his mind, aligning the movements of the household, placement of objects, the ticking of the mechanical chronometer, and the appearance of the envelope. The solution offered by the authorities was elegant in appearance but incoherent when measured against the orchestration required to execute the murder itself. The strands of truth had been selectively revealed, while critical threads had been diverted or hidden entirely. Poirot's small, precise hands moved through invisible diagrams, connecting opportunity to motive, deception to action, and slowly, imperceptibly, forming the contours of the real plan behind the facade of closure. By late afternoon, the chateau was calm once more, but Poirot's mind was alert, humming with anticipation. He knew that a false victory had been celebrated prematurely, that the murderer still lingered in shadow, calculating the next move with patience and cunning. The detective felt the weight of inevitability pressing inward. The moment of revelation was approaching, but it would come only when the criminal, confident in their misdirection, revealed the final subtle mistake that would betray them. Until then, the house held its breath, and Poirot, ever vigilant, waited, understanding that the true solution lay not in what had been discovered, but in what had been deliberately concealed. Poirot sat alone in the library, long after the household had grown quiet, the faint ticking of the chronometer in the study echoing in his mind like a metronome for his thoughts. He pored over every detail again, the notes, the envelope, the statements of the witnesses. Something nagged at him, an overlooked subtlety that resisted interpretation. It was neither in the apparent motives, nor in the false evidence that had been so eagerly celebrated by the authorities. No, it was something buried, something older, perhaps hidden in the tangled histories of those present. He returned to the personal correspondence of Henri Duroc, letters neatly bound in velvet-covered boxes, which had been set aside as trivial. Most were mundane, a mixture of business arrangements and polite invitations, but one envelope, yellowed and brittle, caught his attention. It bore no date, only a scrawled name, R. Langlois. Poirot's memory stirred. That name belonged to a solicitor involved in a decades-old financial scandal that had rocked the Parisian social scene, a scandal that had quietly ended with an out-of-court settlement, leaving lingering bitterness among those affected. Poirot traced the connections with care. The lawyer present at the chateau now, meticulous in his layering of legal defences, had once represented parties entangled in that very scandal. Madame Duroc, too, had been socially connected to several families whose fortunes had been upended by the affair. The seemingly trivial detail of a forgotten dispute now shimmered with potential significance. Perhaps this murder, meticulously executed and masked with contemporary pretexts, was a culmination of old grievances that had lain dormant until opportunity arose. Turning his attention to the household staff, Poirot considered the butler and the young maid in this new light. The butler's long tenure meant he had observed countless interactions, remembered subtle rivalries, and perhaps held grudges invisible to others. The maid's family had ties, however distant, to one of the disgruntled parties whose losses had been quietly absorbed in the past. These were not obvious connections, but the detective's keen sense of human memory and loyalty suggested that old debts, slights, or secrets could influence behavior decades later. Poirot returned to the crime scene with these threads in mind, observing the study anew. The note, the chronometer, the misdirection, all were carefully chosen instruments, but the underlying motive, he now suspected, was rooted not in immediate gain, but in the resolution of a grievance long held in private. The letter mentioning R. Langlois was a breadcrumb, placed either intentionally or left by accident, linking present actions to a past injustice. Poirot's mind worked to reconstruct the timeline of events in terms of both the immediate and the historical, layering the present crime atop a foundation of forgotten tensions. As he reviewed witness statements, small contradictions took on new meaning. Madame Duroc's hesitation, once attributed to fear of exposure or self-interest, now hinted at awareness of old allegiances and unresolved conflicts. The lawyer's careful manipulation of testimony, previously seen as protective of current clients, could also serve to conceal past involvements, ensuring that prior indiscretions remained buried. Even the gardener's vague recollection of shadows and movements gained a richer dimension. Perhaps he had witnessed interactions that, while minor in the present, had historical resonance that tied several parties together. Poirot's eyes lit upon the chronometer again. Its ticking, so precise, was more than mechanical. It was symbolic of the passage of time itself, a deliberate signal in a crime that spanned decades of hidden resentment. The envelope, the note, the misaligned testimonies, they were all part of a scheme not merely of opportunity, but of timing, a choreography meant to exact a reckoning that history had delayed. In this light, the locked room, the meticulous planning, and the false evidence were not just practical tools, they were instruments of psychological precision, ensuring that the weight of the past could arrive with perfect subtlety in the present. By evening, Poirot had reconstructed a provisional map connecting present suspects with historical entanglements. The murder, he now understood, was not a crime of pies. Scion in the moment, but a carefully orchestrated act that drew upon the shadows of decades past. Old grudges, concealed alliances, and forgotten betrayals converged with the immediate opportunity presented by Henri Duroc's routines, creating a deadly intersection of past and present. The detective felt the thrill of insight, knowing that he had uncovered a hidden dimension that would guide the next phase of his inquiry. The unraveling of not only the mechanics of the murder, but the web of human history that had made it possible. As the chateau grew quiet beneath the encroaching night, Poirot, seated in his small chair with hands clasped, allowed the connections to settle in his mind. He understood now that the criminals' cunning lay not only in their execution of the murder, but in their manipulation of memory itself, exploiting decades of buried animosity, and Poirot spent the early evening in quiet contemplation, observing the household with a patience that was almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. The servants moved through the chateau with their usual routines, unaware that each gesture, each glance, could be a revealing fragment of truth. Poirot, seated in a small chair by the fireplace, allowed the soft crackle of embers to provide a rhythmic backdrop to his thoughts. The crime, he realized, was as much about human psychology as it was about mechanical precision, and the subtle interplay of character could provide the breakthrough that physical evidence had failed to deliver. He decided to employ an unconventional tactic. Rather than confront any suspect directly with accusations or force them to recall details they might suppress, he crafted a scenario that would provoke an unguarded response. In the grand drawing room, he arranged a small display, the chronometer from the study, a replication of the note with slight variations, and a folded envelope resembling the one discovered in the garden. The objects were carefully positioned on a table, seemingly for inspection, yet their arrangement was deliberate, meant to observe reactions rather than elicit confessions. One by one, the suspects were invited under the guise of assisting Poirot with reconstructing the timeline. Madame Duroc entered first, her composure intact, but her eyes darting subtly as she noticed the familiar handwriting on the reproduced note. She paused momentarily, an almost imperceptible tightening of her lips, but recovered quickly, offering a polite but evasive comment about the detective's thoroughness. Poirot noted the hesitation, filing it away as a potential psychological tremor, though not yet definitive. The butler approached next, stepping carefully toward the objects. Poirot, speaking gently, asked him to recount the precise moments he had last seen each item in the study, emphasizing the importance of memory and timing. The man's initial confidence faltered when he caught sight of the chronometer ticking on the table, a perfect replica of the one he knew to have been in the study. His hands twitched slightly, a detail imperceptible to all but Poirot. The detective watched the ripple of unease pass over the butler's otherwise controlled demeanor. There was a crack in the facade, a subtle indication that the man's account might conceal more than mere forgetfulness. Poirot then invited the young maid, whose shyness had previously masked her perceptiveness. As she looked at the objects, her eyes lingered on the envelope, and she instinctively drew back, her fingers gripping the edge of her apron. Poirot engaged her gently, asking about the sequence of events she had witnessed. but phrased his questions to suggest that accuracy was more important than absolution. Her initial hesitance gave way to a fleeting admission. She had seen something small, almost trivial, in the hallway, something no one had considered relevant. It was a detail that could connect motive to action, though she did not realize the significance herself. Finally, Poirot turned to the lawyer. The man's face was calm, almost smug, but when he observed the reproduction of the note and the envelope together, a faint flicker of recognition crossed his eyes, replaced immediately by a measured mask of indifference. Poirot pressed slightly, recounting the sequence of events as though seeking the counsel's interpretation of timing and opportunity. The lawyer's carefully curated words stumbled for the briefest instant, a hesitation so small that anyone else would have missed it entirely. Poirot's sharp eyes did not. He noted that this minor falter, this imperceptible slip in a man accustomed to controlling narrative, revealed the potential for deception tied not only to present motives, but to the shadows of past entanglements that Poirot had uncovered. By observing these subtle cracks, the detective began to see the contours of the truth emerging. The unusual tactic, the careful staging of objects, the psychological framing of questions, and the gentle provocation of reactions had yielded more than any direct interrogation. Each tremor, each hesitation, each instinctive response revealed the hidden pressure points in the household's web of deceit. Poirot realized that while the physical clues had been manipulated, the human element could not be entirely controlled. Character, memory, and emotion would always betray the truth if one knew how to watch closely enough. As night deepened over the chateau, Poirot sat back, satisfied. The unconventional clue had not been a single object or observation, but the subtle reactions it had elicited, the small fractures in carefully maintained facades. The detective understood that the next phase of the investigation would require careful attention to these psychological tremors, for it was within them that the real murderer's identity would be revealed. The household remained tense, unaware that under Poirot's meticulous gaze, their slightest movements were now pieces of a puzzle that could no longer hide in shadow, obscured relationships. The shadows of the past had been summoned into the present, and the detective, patient and unyielding, would follow those shadows to their source, exposing the hidden hand behind the seemingly perfect crime. The following morning dawned pale and grey, the chateau cloaked in mist that seemed to mirror the unease settling over the household. Poirot, immersed in his detailed reconstruction of events from the previous evening, was interrupted by the sudden clatter of footsteps in the hall. The butler appeared, pale and flustered, carrying a small box that should have contained the chronometer. Poirot's sharp eyes immediately detected the irregularity. The lid was slightly ajar, the device missing. "Mon Dieu," the butler stammered. It was here just last night. I placed it back in the study exactly where Monsieur le Detective instructed." His voice wavered, betraying more than mere surprise. There was a hint of fear, an undertone of something unsaid. Poirot, ever calm, motioned for him to step aside and carefully examined the box. The interior was empty, the delicate mechanism gone. It had been removed with care, not in haste. The thief, Poirot concluded, was no amateur. This was a deliberate act aimed at undermining the investigation. The detective's mind raced as he retraced the sequence of events. The chronometer had been central to understanding the timing of the murder, the key to unraveling how the locked room scenario had been executed. Its disappearance threatened to undo the painstaking work he had begun, and yet, as always, Poirot perceived the significance of the act not merely in its physical loss, but in the psychological message it carried. Someone within the chateau was attempting to manipulate the course of justice, to steer the investigation away from the truth. Poirot's attention immediately shifted to the household. Every individual was now a potential suspect, each capable of premeditated interference. Madame Duroc appeared calm, serene even, though Poirot noted a subtle tension in the set of her shoulders. The lawyer, who had previously faltered at the sight of the reproduced note, was conspicuously absent from the morning's activities, citing urgent paperwork, an explanation Poirot filed away with quiet suspicion. The maid hovered near the door, her gaze downcast, her hands wringing nervously. Even the gardener, usually detached, lingered a little too long near the study's threshold. All were under observation. Poirot quickly assessed the security of the chateau. The locked study, once thought impervious, had evidently been breached without leaving obvious signs. The removal of the chronometer suggested intimate knowledge of both the household routines and the detective's investigate. Methods. Poirot considered the implications. Whoever had taken the device had likely been watching carefully, waiting for the moment when the detective's attention would be divided, then striking with precision. It was an audacious move, signaling both desperation and cunning. As he questioned the staff again, Poirot employed subtle psychological pressure, asking indirect questions about their movements, their awareness of others, and what they might have noticed in the study during the early hours. Each answer was measured, rehearsed, yet small inconsistencies emerged. The maid hesitated when asked about the night before, her eyes flicking to Madame Duroc, as if seeking silent permission. The gardener, when pressed, muttered about seeing shadows moving near the study, but could provide no further detail. Poirot took careful note. The removal of the chronometer was not only physical but symbolic, a warning and a test revealing which individuals might bend to coercion or complicity. Poirot also revisited the prior evidence, the envelope in the garden, the note on the desk, the reactions of the suspects to the staged objects, and now saw these moments in a new light. The disappearance of the chronometer was no isolated incident. It fit within a pattern of deliberate distraction and misdirection. The criminals sought to control the flow of the investigation, to bury key elements before the detective could synthesize them. And yet, Poirot realized, the act itself betrayed confidence as well as fear. Only someone deeply familiar with the household and the detective's methods could attempt such a maneuver. By mid-afternoon, Poirot had reconstructed a new mental map, taking into account the vanished device and its implications for both the timeline and the psychology of the household. The stakes had risen, trust had become fragile, every glance, every gesture laden with potential deception. Yet, even in the face of this brazen act, Poirot's mind worked with its customary precision. He understood that the vanishing evidence, while a setback in practical terms, had exposed vulnerabilities and hidden motives, offering new avenues for deduction. The true culprit had revealed their confidence and their desperation simultaneously, and Poirot, patient and vigilant, would follow these threads with unerring attention until the final, inescapable truth emerged. Late that evening, just as the chateau had settled into a tense quiet, a scream shattered the stillness, echoing through the long corridors like a jagged note. Poirot, seated in the library with his meticulous notes spread before him, rose instantly, his small frame moving with purposeful urgency. The household erupted into panic as he and the butler raced toward the source of the disturbance, Madame Duroc's private sitting room. The sight that met him was shocking. Madame Duroc lay collapsed against the floor, pale and unconscious, a deep gash across her temple. A toppled vase nearby suggested a struggle. Yet there was no sign of forced entry. The windows remained latched, the door locked from the inside as it had been moments before. The butler and maid hovered at the threshold, terror etched across their faces, but Poirot's sharp eyes noted the small, telling details: a footprint smudged lightly in the dust by the corner of the desk, a faint smear of ink near the edge of a writing table, and the absence of any immediate trace of the perpetrator. Poirot knelt beside Madame Duroc, checking for signs of life. She was breathing steadily, though faintly, and he instructed the others to summon medical aid immediately. His mind, however, was already racing. This was not a random accident, it was deliberate, a calculated act designed to terrify, to manipulate, and to signal that the criminal remained several steps ahead. Whoever had orchestrated Henri Duroc's murder and the removal of the chronometer now proved capable of physical aggression, capable of striking without warning and vanishing as if into thin air. The detective's gaze swept the room. Nothing else appeared disturbed. There was no weapon, no forced entry, and no sign of hurried escape. Poirot's mind considered the possibilities. The perpetrator must have been intimately familiar with the layout of the room, the habits of its occupants, and the timing necessary to avoid detection. The previous crimes, he realized, were only precursors, tests, distractions, manipulations, designed to prepare both the household and the authorities for a more audacious strike. Poirot questioned the butler and the maid again, this time focusing on precise movements and timing rather than statements of general knowledge. The butler admitted he had checked on Madame Duroc several times during the afternoon, each time finding her engaged in her usual routines. The maid had been tasked with arranging candles in the sitting room, but had stepped out briefly, only to return moments later and find her mistress collapsed. Each account was carefully cross-referenced with Poirot's own observations of the house's layout, creating a timeline of movements that the criminal must have anticipated in detail. He noticed something unusual near the fireplace, a faint glimmer in the embers, too metallic to be coincidental. Poirot knelt, brushing aside the ashes to reveal a small, intricately designed key, one that did not belong to any lock in the immediate vicinity. Its presence was a clue, a deliberate breadcrumb left either by accident or by design. This key suggested that the perpetrator had access to hidden compartments or rooms within the chateau, secret spaces that could serve as a route for attack, escape, or observation. Poirot felt a thrill of recognition. The investigation had just shifted into a higher dimension. By the time the physician arrived to tend to Madame Duroc, Poirot had reconstructed a preliminary theory. The second attack was not merely a continuation of the first, it was a warning, a demonstration that the criminal could act at will, that no precaution was sufficient, and that the stakes had risen sharply. It became clear to him that the murderer's intelligence and patience made the case not only a challenge of deduction, but a battle of foresight. The detective's task was no longer to reconstruct a past act, but to anticipate future ones, to protect potential victims while tracing the careful, hidden maneuvers of a mind both brilliant and ruthless. Poirot stood in the dim light of the sitting room, the key clutched delicately in his gloved hand. He sensed the tension in the air, the fragile fear that now gripped the household, and he understood the full scale of the challenge before him. The criminal remained several moves ahead, elusive and dangerous, but each action left a trace, subtle and precise, for a mind capable of reading it. Poirot, as always, would follow those traces, unraveling deception, anticipating danger, and bringing the hidden hand into the light. The case, once thought solvable through ordinary deduction, had transformed into a contest of intellect and courage, a battle where vigilance was paramount, and the next move could be deadly. Poirot spent the night reviewing his notes in the small confines of the library, the storm outside lashing at the chateau with occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated the polished surfaces and casting shifting shadows across the floor. Each piece of evidence, each statement, each minor discrepancy was laid out before him like pieces of a complex mosaic. The theft of the chronometer, the cryptic note, Madame Duroc's attack, and the subtle cracks in the behavior of the household staff. All of it seemed chaotic at first glance, yet Poirot knew that nature abhors true randomness and a pattern must exist. He returned to the study, moving deliberately, examining the placement of objects, the dust on the floor and the minor abrasions on furniture. His eyes fell upon a small detail that had previously seemed trivial, a decorative paperweight, a modest crystal globe slightly shifted from its usual alignment on the desk. Poirot's mind, trained to notice the slightest deviation from routine, recognized the significance instantly. It was not merely a displaced ornament, its angle and position corresponded exactly with the placement of the chronometer and the note on previous occasions. He saw, with a flash of clarity, that each object involved in the crime, note, chronometer, envelope, and now this globe, was deliberately positioned to form a pattern, a triangulation of action and observation that mapped the perpetrator's strategy. Poirot's gaze then turned inward toward the testimonies he had collected. The minor hesitations, the fleeting glances, the instinctive gestures, each previously catalogued but not fully understood, now revealed themselves as deliberate responses to that pattern. Madame Duroc's composure, the butler's subtle nervous twitches, the lawyer's momentary flicker of recognition, the maid's timid confessions, all of them were connected, reacting subconsciously to cues embedded within the carefully arranged objects. The criminal had been orchestrating a psychological symphony, ensuring that everyone's behavior would produce clues in plain sight if one possessed the patience and acuity to notice. Poirot's mind reconstructed the sequence of events once again, integrating the overlooked paperweight into the timeline. The alignment of objects now suggested precise moments in which each act had occurred. The removal of the chronometer, the planting of the envelope, the attack on Madame Duroc. Each movement was not random but choreographed, a methodical demonstration of the murderer's intimate knowledge of the chateau's routines and the habits of its occupants. The seemingly small details, the slight smudge of dust on the globe, the angled tilt of a chair, a forgotten pen mark, were, in fact, markers of this hidden sequence, breadcrumbs that had been in plain sight all along, awaiting a mind capable of interpretation. He reflected on the psychological strategy of the perpetrator. By manipulating minor objects and exploiting the natural reactions of those around him, the criminal had created the illusion of chaos while subtly revealing the path to discovery. Poirot's insight deepened. The clues had never been buried, nor had they been truly hidden. The criminal had believed that human attention would overlook what was ordinary, yet ordinary objects had been arranged with extraordinary precision to expose the pattern for the keen observer. Poirot revisited the previous incidents, now understanding them through the lens of this emerging order. The theft of the chronometer was less about concealment and more about provoking panic, to see who would react and how. Madame Duroc's attack, executed with seeming spontaneity, was a test of compliance and instinct. Even the staged envelope, celebrated as a breakthrough by the authorities, was a psychological trap, designed to measure responses rather than convey factual confession. Each element, once confusing and misleading, now fit perfectly into the coherent pattern he discerned. With this realization, Poirot's attention returned to the suspects. He could now interpret the small fissures in their statements, the inconsistencies in timing, and the fleeting reactions to staged objects as integral parts of the puzzle. The criminal's plan was both audacious and meticulous. They had relied on the assumption that chaos would obscure clarity, that attention would be drawn to grand gestures rather than subtle details. Poirot's insight overturned that assumption. As dawn broke over the mist-shrouded grounds of the chateau, the detective allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The pattern had emerged, delicate yet unmistakable, woven through objects, gestures, and behaviors alike. What had once seemed a labyrinth of confusion was now revealed as a precise, deliberate design. Poirot understood, with quiet certainty, that the key to apprehending the murderer lay within the very details that had been hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for a mind capable of discerning the hidden order beneath the apparent chaos. Poirot spent the morning retracing every step of the investigation, not with the goal of reaffirming what he already knew, but to illuminate the subtler threads that had eluded even the most careful scrutiny. The pattern had emerged, the carefully placed objects, the reactions of the household, the stolen chronometer, but the underlying motive, the true force driving such meticulous orchestration, had remained tantalizingly obscure. It was clear now that the criminal's actions were guided not merely by greed, jealousy, or fear, but by something far deeper, something that had been invisible beneath the surface of apparent human desire. He began with Madame Duroc, reviewing her testimony, in light of the pattern he had discerned. On the surface, she seemed composed, dignified, a widow concerned with propriety and social standing. Yet the subtle tremors in her behavior, the near imperceptible hesitation when certain objects were presented, suggested a profound emotional connection to the deceased beyond social convention. Poirot's attention turned to a series of letters hidden in the desk drawers, letters that revealed not only affection, but also entreaties and warnings, intimate knowledge of secrets long thought buried. Here was evidence that Henri Duroc had held power over more than finances. He had wielded influence over emotions, loyalty, and pride, an influence that had left deep and lasting scars. The detective next considered Ed the butler, whose meticulous care had often appeared a mere professional trait. But in reviewing the subtle shifts in his testimony, Poirot discerned the faint imprint of resentment accumulated over decades of service. The butler's loyalty had been earned and tested, manipulated by small cruelties and persistent oversight, and yet his precise knowledge of household routines and movements made him uniquely capable of orchestrating both misdirection and surveillance. It was not simple revenge, Poirot realized. It was a meticulously nurtured need to reclaim control, to assert dominance where none had been permitted for so long, to transform years of subservience into a single act of mastery. Then the revelation crystallized when Poirot examined the young maid's timid yet observant behavior. She had seemed inconsequential, a peripheral witness, but her subtle acknowledgement of small details, her awareness of interpersonal tension, and her instinctive reactions to staged objects revealed something hidden. A formative experience long ago in which she had witnessed the destructive power of unchecked influence. Her presence in the household, silent and often overlooked, had provided both a mirror and a reminder of the consequences of manipulation, though she herself had not acted violently. Yet, Poirot's sharp mind drew connections across decades and personalities, revealing that the murder of Henri Duroc was not a simple transaction of material gain or petty vengeance. The killer, or killers, had acted from a profound desire to correct a perceived imbalance of power, to punish psychological tyranny, to assert moral and emotional equilibrium in a world skewed by subtle but insidious domination. The pattern of objects, the theft of the chronometer, the staged envelope, the attack on Madame Duroc, they were not merely practical steps but symbolic acts, expressions of a psychologue. Écale narrative, meant to expose the corrupting influence of the victim while controlling the way others perceived the events. Poirot understood now why the perpetrator had acted with such precision and foresight. Ordinary motives would have produced ordinary errors. The careful choreography of the crime suggested a mind deeply invested in justice, as defined by personal moral calculus, rather than law. The criminals' psychology was extreme but coherent. They sought not simply to eliminate a threat, but to make every action, every moment, resonate with meaning, to impose order upon the chaos wrought by emotional and social manipulation. The detective reflected on the small, telling signs that had hinted at this hidden motive all along: the fleeting hesitation of Madame Duroc, the butler's twitch of fear, the lawyer's faint flicker of recognition, the maid's subtle avoidance. Each had been a cipher of emotional truth, a reflection of long-buried conflicts now manifest in the present. What had seemed like indecision, anxiety, or misdirection was, in fact, a response to the underlying psychological drama, the narrative of power and retribution that had driven the crime from its inception. By late afternoon, Poirot had reconstructed the full landscape of motive. The crime was an intricate interplay of human psychology, orchestrated with extraordinary patience and precision. The true villain was revealed not merely by what they had done, but by why they had done it. The desire to redress wrongs invisible to ordinary eyes, to assert moral authority over years of subtle tyranny, and to make the act of crime itself a reflection of deeper justice. Poirot leaned back, contemplative, recognizing that this insight into the criminal psyche would be crucial not only for solving the case, but for anticipating the final moves that would bring the hidden hand into the light. The chateau was seedy, leant under the pale moonlight, its shadows stretching long across the polished floors, as Poirot moved with deliberate calm, every step measured, every gesture purposeful. He had spent the day reconstructing the pattern, connecting the psychological insights with the physical evidence, and now, at last, the pieces had fallen into place. The final confrontation would not be a chaotic struggle, but a precise orchestration, a setting in which the villain would reveal themselves through their own impulses, unable to resist the subtle pressures Poirot had prepared. He gathered the household in the drawing-room, the flickering candlelight casting an uneven glow across the assembled faces. Each person was present under the guise of discussion, yet Poirot's eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept over them with the certainty of a conductor ready to signal the first note of a symphony. Madame Duroc, fragile yet composed, the butler standing rigidly at the back, the lawyer with his carefully maintained mask of propriety, and the maid, timid but observant, all awaited his words. Poirot spoke slowly, framing his narrative with the meticulous care of a master storyteller. He recounted the sequence of events, emphasizing the stolen chronometer, the envelope, and the carefully arranged objects in the study. He highlighted reactions, subtle inconsistencies, and, most importantly, the pattern that had emerged from seemingly trivial details. His voice carried no accusation, only observation, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Each sentence was designed not to corner, but to draw out the unconscious truths hidden within human behavior. As he approached the climactic moment, Poirot directed his gaze toward the butler, whose earlier nervous twitch had never escaped him. He recounted, in calm and precise detail, the minor irregularities in testimony, the subtle hesitation when confronted. With the staged objects, the small adjustments in body language when questioned about timing and movement. The room grew taut with silent tension, every eye following the detective's deliberate articulation, and Poirot watched for the slightest flicker of recognition, the imperceptible crack in the facade. The butler's composure, so carefully maintained, faltered almost imperceptibly. His hands twitched, a bead of sweat appeared at his temple, and his gaze shifted briefly to the window as though considering escape. Poirot held the moment, allowing it to expand. "Monsieur," he said softly, "it is not merely the act that reveals truth, but the mind behind it. One cannot orchestrate such events without revealing oneself through the smallest motions, the tiniest slips. Observe how the pattern aligns with your knowledge, your opportunities, and your motives." A sudden, sharp intake of breath betrayed the butler's realization that he could not escape detection. His voice, controlled at first, began to tremble as he attempted a half-hearted denial, only for Poirot to calmly, inexorably dismantle each excuse with precise references to observed actions, timelines, and psychological responses. Each phrase Poirot delivered was a mirror reflecting the butler's own calculated choices, forcing recognition that the net had closed and that concealment was no longer possible. Finally, the butler made a desperate move, reaching toward a side table as though to flee or seize a weapon, but Poirot's small, precise hand intercepted him with a firmness that brooked no resistance. The butler froze, understanding that his options had vanished. Poirot, maintaining his composed demeanor, observed the final tremor of defiance fade from the man's expression. The confession, slow and reluctant at first, poured forth in careful detail, explaining the theft of the chronometer, the placement of the envelope, the psychological orchestration designed to manipulate the household, and ultimately the attack on Madame Duroc. The revelation was both shocking and inevitable. The butler had acted not for simple gain, but driven by a convoluted sense of justice, a need to redress perceived slights and reclaim a form of authority long denied him. Every step, every object, every psychological manipulation had been calculated with painstaking care, yet each action had left subtle traces that Poirot's acute observation could decipher. The truth had been hidden in plain sight, woven into patterns of routine, timing, and human reaction. As the household absorbed the confession, a profound silence fell. Poirot, ever the composed observer, allowed the weight of understanding to settle, knowing that the danger had passed and the pattern of events had finally been reeve. Allied in its entirety. The butler, subdued and aware of the consequences, was escorted away, and Poirot remained in the room a moment longer, reflecting on the delicate interplay of motive, opportunity, and human psychology that had led to the resolution. In the quiet aftermath, the detective allowed himself a small, private satisfaction. The case, complex and seemingly impenetrable, had been unraveled with patience, intellect, and an unerring attention to the smallest, most telling details. The household exhaled a collective sigh of relief. The butler, the architect of manipulation and psychological torment, had confessed, and it seemed as though the long nightmare had ended. Madame Duroc, pale but steady, allowed herself a faint, fragile smile, while the lawyer and the maid exchanged glances of cautious gratitude. Poirot, seated calmly near the fireplace, allowed the sense of closure to settle, but only briefly. A detective, he knew, never trusted appearances entirely, especially when human cunning had been involved. As he revisited the sequence in his mind, a subtle irregularity began to surface, one that had escaped notice in the rush of confession. The butler's knowledge, while intimate, did not account for every detail. Certain nuances, the timing of the chronometer's disappearance, the precise placement of the envelope in the garden, the apparent impossibility of the attack on Madame Duroc, had been explained, yes, but only partially. Poirot's acute observation flagged a final discrepancy. One small item, a folded slip of paper, had been overlooked in the earlier review of the study. He picked it up with gloved hands, noting the elegant, unfamiliar handwriting and the sharpness of the ink, still fresh enough to suggest recent use. The writing on the slip was brief but pointed, a cryptic note that seemed to mock both the investigation and the confessed butler. It high. Hinted at knowledge of hidden passages, secret timings, and an awareness of Poirot's own tactics. It was subtle, almost playful, but unmistakably purposeful. The confession, Poirot realized, while true in its broad strokes, might have been orchestrated to conceal an even deeper intelligence, one that had manipulated the butler as a pawn. A chill of understanding swept through him. The criminal mind he had already unraveled was not the ultimate architect. Someone else, someone entirely unexpected, had guided events from the shadows, ensuring that the butler would take the fall, while the real mastermind remained unseen. Poirot called the household together once more, carefully observing each person as he spoke. He mentioned the new evidence indirectly, discussing timing and opportunity with hypotheticals, allowing reactions to emerge naturally. It was then that a subtle yet unmistakable flicker crossed Madame Duroc's eyes, a hesitation, a tightening of her hands, the barest shadow of tension, betrayed knowledge she could not have possessed without intimate involvement. Poirot's mind raced, connecting dots he had previously overlooked, her meticulous composure, the careful phrasing of her previous statements, the way she had subtly guided the placement of objects in the sitting room. The realization struck him fully. Madame Duroc had orchestrated far more than anyone suspected. The butler had been her instrument, carefully manipulated to take responsibility for the crime, while she, shielded by her social position and the household's assumptions, operated with near-invisible precision. The motive, previously interpreted as the butler's need for control and revenge, was entwined with her own long-standing grievances, her desire to assert dominance over hidden injustices, and her skillful management of human psychology. Every move, every reaction, every planted clue had been designed to guide Poirot and the others toward the wrong conclusion. Until now, Poirot allowed the tension to build. He presented the final observation, each word deliberate, each fact carefully framed to elicit confession without accusation. He spoke of timing, opportunity, and knowledge of the chateau, watching intently as the smallest gestures betrayed truth. And then, under the calm, unrelenting pressure of his scrutiny, Madame Duroc's composure cracked. Her voice, steady at first, trembled as she admitted her orchestration of the events, her manipulation of the butler, and her intricate plotting that had elevated what might have been a simple crime into a masterpiece of psychological control. The revelation stunned the household. The butler, though guilty of minor complicity, had been merely a tool in a far more sophisticated scheme. Poirot, ever composed, allowed the shock to settle around them, explaining with gentle precision how the chain of events had been designed to mislead, manipulate, and control perception, culminating in a confession that almost, but not entirely, revealed the truth. The final twist, brilliant in its subtlety, affirmed the genius of the criminal mind he faced, yet also underscored Poirot's own unmatched capacity for observation, patience, and deduction. As Madame Duroc was led away, the detective remained standing, hands clasped, reflecting on the delicate interplay of human psychology and meticulous planning. Even when a case seemed resolved, Poirot knew, the truth often lurked beneath layers of deception, waiting for the observant mind to reveal it. The chateau, now silent in the late night, bore witness to the unmasking of not one, but 2 layers of cunning, and Poirot allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. The final twist had tested his genius, yet, as always, the truth had emerged under the steady, unflinching gaze of the little grey. Cells. The dawn broke over the chateau with an almost cruel serenity, the morning light spilling across polished floors that had borne witness to a web of deception, manipulation, and hidden motives. The household moved with a subdued quiet, the shock of Madame Duroc's revelation still lingering in their expressions. Poirot, ever composed, took a moment to observe the room, noting the lingering glances of fear, relief, and disbelief. The truth had been revealed, the layers of cunning unraveled, yet the consequences of such revelations were never so simple as to allow complete closure. Madame Duroc had been taken into custody, but Poirot's mind, trained to consider every possibility, lingered on subtleties that might escape ordinary notice. The confession had been precise, the orchestration brilliant, yet even as the household breathed easier, he considered the potential for misdirection, the possibility of overlooked contingencies. Justice, Poirot knew, was never merely about arresting the guilty. It was about understanding the entirety of the puzzle, ensuring that every hidden thread was accounted for. He gathered the household once more, not to accuse, but to explain. Poirot's method was always one of demonstration. The detective meticulously walked them through the sequence of events, connecting each object, each hesitation, each seemingly trivial gesture to the broader scheme. He began with the chronometer, explaining its role in manipulating timing and psychological pressure, then the envelope planted in the garden, the precise arrangement of objects in the study, and finally, the attack on Madame Duroc, now fully contextualized within the psychological narrative orchestrated by the true mastermind. Poirot's voice, calm yet insistent, drew attention to the reactions of each individual. "Observe," he said softly, gesturing to the minor tremor of the maid's hands. A fleeting flicker in the lawyer's eyes, the subtle rigidity of the butler's posture. Each response, seemingly insignificant, had been a signal, a piece of the puzzle that, when combined, revealed the full tapestry of deception. He detailed how Madame Duroc had manipulated these responses, carefully orchestrating both the appearance of her own vulnerability and the butler's role as scapegoat. The detective paused, letting the weight of the explanation settle, and then addressed the remaining question. The slight irregularities in the timing, the almost imperceptible hints that something else might have been in play. Poirot revealed the final subtlety, the slip of paper with the unfamiliar handwriting discovered only after the confession, which indicated that, while the crime had been largely orchestrated by Madame Duroc, an unknown accomplice or observer had influenced minor actions to ensure precision and misdirection. It was a reminder that even the most brilliant plot could have elements beyond immediate comprehension. As he concluded, Poirot emphasized the lesson hidden in the minutiae. Justice, while delivered in form, must always be understood in substance. The guilty had been apprehended, the immediate danger neutralized, yet human cunning remained a force that could never be entirely constrained. The subtle, overlooked details, the paperweight's position, the shadow of hesitation in a glance, the faint imprint of dust or smudge, were the keys to perception, proof that only a mind trained to notice could truly grasp the depth of human strategy and misdirection. The household, now fully aware of the intricacies and the near-invisible threads that had governed events, absorbed the explanation in silence. Relief mingled with lingering tension. The resolution was satisfying, yet the reminder of unseen possibilities left an uneasy awareness that the human mind, capable of such intricate design, could never be entirely predicted or contained. Poirot, standing quietly by the fireplace, allowed a faint smile of satisfaction. The case was closed in the sense of law, the villain captured, yet the detective's awareness acknowledged a final, uncomfortable truth. Human cunning is a shadowy adversary, one that might manifest again in ways unanticipated. As the household dispersed, some to resume their routines, others to process the morning's revelations, Poirot remained behind, contemplating the final patterns. He reflected on the delicate interplay of timing, psychology, and observation that had revealed the hidden mastermind, and how the smallest of clues, misplaced objects, fleeting expressions, and minor gestures, had been the linchpins of truth. Justice had been served, yet the experience reinforced the eternal lesson that vigilance, insight, and the meticulous application of reason were the only defenses against the subtle, pervasive shadows of human deceit. In the quiet aftermath, Poirot's mind remained alert, knowing that even in victory, the world always contained mysteries waiting to be unraveled. The chateau, now bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon, felt almost peaceful, though the air still carried a subtle tension, the residue of events that had unfolded over the past days. Poirot, with his small frame poised and his hands folded neatly in front of him, walked slowly through the corridors, absorbing the quiet as though it were another layer of evidence. The household had resumed a semblance of routine, but he sensed the undercurrent of unease, the awareness that even the most brilliant resolution could not entirely erase the memory of deception and danger. As he passed the study, Poirot paused, his keen eyes drawn once again to the arrangement of objects. The chronometer now restored, the envelope filed away, the paperweight returned to its place. Yet a tiny detail caught his attention, a faint, almost imperceptible crease along the edge of the letter that had revealed Madame Duroc's orchestration. It suggested that someone had handled it after he had last examined it, a subtle disturbance in what he had considered a closed record. Poirot's mind stirred with curiosity, not alarm, for he understood that mysteries often lingered in the overlooked, in the subtle gestures of human behavior or the hidden traces of action that escaped casual observation. He moved into the garden, where the morning sun cast long shadows over the carefully manicured paths. The envelope that had been found there lay undisturbed, yet Poirot noticed the soil near its resting place was slightly more compacted than natural, as if recently pressed. It was a trivial observation to most, but to the detective it hinted that the orchestrator of events, or perhaps an unseen hand, had returned, even fleetingly, to confirm or adjust their work. There was a rhythm to human behavior that could not be entirely controlled, even in retreat. Patterns left echoes, subtle signals that could ignite the imagination of the observant mind. Poirot's thoughts drifted to the household, to the human element that had made the case so complex. The butler, manipulated yet complicit, Madame Duroc, brilliant and calculating. The maid, silent but perceptive, the lawyer, careful and cautious. Each had played a role in the intricate choreography of deceit, yet Poirot sensed that human impulses, unpredictable and nuanced, could leave lingering questions long after the apparent resolution. The layers of psychology, carefully peeled back, had revealed a truth that was satisfying yet incomplete, enough to close the case legally, but never entirely in spirit. He walked slowly back into the chateau, noticing a small detail he had not yet explored, a fold. Dead scrap of paper, tucked behind a row of books on the lower shelf. It bore no signature, no immediate explanation, only a cryptic message: observe what is unseen, for even the smallest shadow holds a story. Poirot's eyes narrowed, the corners crinkling with subtle amusement. The message was not threatening, nor did it indicate immediate danger, yet it hinted at a truth beyond the case he had just solved. A reminder that human cunning was an inexhaustible resource, and that vigilance was never complete. The detective allowed himself a quiet smile as he stepped into the open courtyard, feeling the weight of accomplishment, tempered by the awareness that the world remained rich with mysteries. Justice had been served in the visible sense. The orchestrator of events had been revealed, yet even the smallest clue suggested that the landscape of human deception was far from exhausted. There would always be patterns to discern, subtle gestures to interpret, and secrets waiting to be uncovered by the patient, meticulous mind. As Poirot prepared to depart the chateau, he paused briefly at the threshold, glancing back at the garden, the study, and the rooms that had been the stage for so much intrigue. The case was officially closed, yet a sense of curiosity lingered, like the final note of a complex symphony, reverberating just beyond reach. The detective's keen mind, ever alert, knew that this resolution was merely one chapter, and that the little grey cells would soon be summoned again to unravel the next hidden truth. With that quiet anticipation, Poirot stepped away, leaving the chateau behind, and carrying with him the certainty that mysteries never truly end. They only pause, awaiting the observant mind capable of seeing what others cannot.